The rain hadn't stopped for hours. It fell in waves against the glass walls of St. Haven Medical Center, blurring the city skyline into streaks of silver and shadow, the kind of night where something either ends or begins. Inside Trauma Room 6, the world moved in fragments, flashing monitors, tense voices, hands soaked in crimson urgency. Julian Cross lay motionless on the operating table, his face pale beneath the harsh light, his heartbeat erratic, his lungs gasping for rhythm. He was more than just a patient. He was the man behind Orion Pharma, a pharmaceutical empire that had revolutionized modern medicine, a billionaire who signed deals with a flick of his pen and never heard the word no. But tonight, none of that mattered. His blood type was AB negative, dangerously rare, and the hospital supply was already depleted. The clock was ticking, doctors whispering, nurses scanning donor lists that kept coming back blank. He had minutes left, maybe less. Across the city, a girl was rinsing out coffee cups in a staff kitchen with fluorescent lights that hummed like broken dreams. Leah Gray, 22, nursing student, quiet, tired, invisible. She had spent her evening helping children with fevers and elderly patients who forgot their names, and, as always, she stopped at the blood donation center on her way out, part habit, part hope that maybe something ordinary could become meaningful. She never asked where her blood went, never wondered if it did anything at all. She just filled the forms, rolled up her sleeve, and walked back into the night, unaware that her blood wouldn't stay in storage for long. Within 30 minutes, her sample was flagged, rushed to the trauma center downtown, and running through the veins of a dying man she'd never met. What happened next wasn't just medical. It was inexplicable. Julian's vitals stabilized almost immediately, faster than any known trauma recovery recorded at the facility. His collapsed lung reinflated, his liver restarted, and the bleeding stopped on its own. At first, the staff assumed coincidence. Then they ran more tests. His bone marrow was regenerating, faster than should be possible, and the common factor in every scan, every result, was the blood. Not just rare, but responsive, active, almost alive. Lab techs began analyzing the donor sample, finding gene expressions that weren't supposed to exist, protein structures that didn't match any known database. Eventually, the head researcher, a woman with 30 years in cellular pathology, whispered the phrase that turned science into story: genetic purity, a regenerative anomaly linked to virginity, a concept dismissed for decades, now pulsing in real time through a billionaire's bloodstream. Leah remained unaware, eating cereal on the floor of her apartment, sketching in the margins of her anatomy textbook, while across town, doctors scrambled to find her. No one had her name yet, only a file code, a hospital timestamp, and one marked line under medical status. No sexual history, no biological complications. It took another day before the code matched a name, another 6 hours before someone made the call, and even then, the only reason she answered was because she thought it was about her tuition paperwork. Meanwhile, Julian woke slowly, his mind foggy, his body unfamiliar, like something had been burned away and reborn. He didn't ask about the crash or his company or the press already circling his hospital room like vultures. He asked one question, quiet, steady, impossible to ignore. Who saved me? No one answered, but far from the hospital, Leah opened her eyes in the dark, heart racing, breath caught in her throat like she'd been touched by something or someone she couldn't name. She didn't know it yet, but her blood had changed a billionaire's fate, and soon his world would come looking for her. Leah Gray had always lived quietly, not out of fear, but out of habit, the kind of girl who blended into library corners and took the long way home just to avoid unnecessary conversation. She grew up in a small town upstate, the kind of place where everybody knew everybody's grandmother, but no one knew what you were going through, not really. Her father died when she was 8, leukemia, a battle that drained their savings and shattered whatever warmth was left in their home. Her mother, worn down by grief and double shifts at the diner, followed 5 years later. a silent heart attack during her 4th consecutive weekend on call. Leah was 13, silent, staring at a chipped kitchen table while paramedics carried away what little remained of the only family she had. From that point on, survival became routine. Foster care, food stamps, and secondhand textbooks shaped her adolescence. But so did her determination. She got herself into a decent high school, earned every scholarship they offered, and eventually landed at Columbia Medical Institute, studying to become a nurse, not because she loved blood or bodies, but because somewhere deep down, she still believed in healing, even if she'd never received it herself. She lived in a shared apartment with 2 other girls who barely spoke to her, worked evenings at an urgent care clinic, and donated blood not because she had extra, but because it was one of the few things she could give without losing more. Leah didn't drink, didn't date, didn't let anyone close. Not because of trauma. Not exactly. But because every time someone had come too close, they eventually left. And she'd learned that being untouched wasn't weakness, it was survival. Julian Cross, on the other hand, had been touched by everything the world could offer, and none of it had ever stayed. Born into legacy wealth, educated at private schools with marble floors, he inherited a biotech firm at 27 and turned it into a global empire within 5 years. The media called him brilliant, the markets called him lethal, but those who knew him best, few as they were, called him something else entirely: unreachable. After a very public engagement dissolved in scandal, after several women came and went with headlines that stung more than they healed, Julian became a ghost in his own tower, speaking only when required, appearing only when strategic. He had everything, and yet lived like he owned nothing worth holding on to. His penthouse was sleek, full of glass and steel but void of photos, warmth, or memory. His staff barely saw him, his business partners never hugged him. He kept 1 bottle of bourbon in a locked cabinet, not for drinking, but because it had belonged to his father, the only man whose silence had ever felt more powerful than Julian's own. Beneath the surface, though, something was breaking. The stress, the pressure, the decisions that made or ruined lives, with a signature all of it had worn thin the man everyone assumed was invincible. He didn't talk about the insomnia or the numbness in his fingertips that wouldn't go away. Didn't mention how cold the penthouse felt even in summer. Didn't tell anyone that some mornings he stared at the mirror for minutes without blinking, waiting to see if he still looked human. Then came the accident. He had been on his way to a board dinner, distracted by the news of a corporate betrayal that would cost billions, and the last thing he remembered was the sound of tires screeching, metal twisting, then silence. The hospital told him later that he had flatlined twice, that his internal bleeding should have killed him, that the odds were impossible. But then there was the donor, unnamed, unmatched, unexplainable. Her blood had saved him. And not just saved, revived, regenerated, reawakened something he hadn't even known was dying. He didn't know her name. Not yet, but something in him couldn't let it go. Back in her apartment, Leah scribbled in the margin of her notebook, sketching a pair of eyes she couldn't place. Eyes that felt like they were searching, like they had seen something they weren't supposed to, and she wondered, just for a second, why the night air outside her window felt heavier than usual, as if someone somewhere had just whispered her name without knowing it. Julian didn't believe in fate, at least not the kind written in stars or whispered by fortune-tellers. He believed in data, strategy, and calculated risk. But something about the girl whose blood now lived inside his body refused to be treated as a coincidence. When his assistant handed him the file, the one that finally put a name and face to the anonymous donor, he read it 3 times in silence, as if doing so would explain why her name felt familiar, though they had never met. Leah Gray, nursing student, Columbia Medical Institute, volunteer blood donor, no prior medical complications, unmarried, no public records of sexual activity. Not that the last part should have mattered, but for some reason it did. The moment he saw her photo, not the kind you find on social media with filters and fake smiles, but a candid hospital ID shot with tired eyes and no makeup. Something in him shifted. Not attraction exactly. Not yet. More like curiosity, pulling at the edge of his control. He told himself he just wanted to thank her, nothing more, a gesture of gratitude, of decency. But when she walked into his private recovery suite 3 days later, wearing jeans 2 shades too faded and a backpack that looked like it had survived more than she had, the word thank you dissolved somewhere behind his teeth. She stood by the door, eyes wary, hands clenched, clearly uncomfortable, clearly not expecting luxury. The nurse introduced her quickly, then left, and for a moment neither of them spoke. She didn't smile, didn't gush, didn't look impressed by the glass walls or the panoramic skyline view. She looked like someone who had been forced to show up and was already planning how fast she could leave. That made him lean forward, elbows on his knees, voice quiet when he finally said her name, not like a question, but like an acknowledgement. She nodded once, said, "Hi," then added quickly that she hadn't known where her blood was going, hadn't asked, hadn't expected anything in return. He said he understood, but he didn't, not really, because in his world, no one ever gave anything without expecting more. She was the first. They spoke for less than 10 minutes, mostly formalities, mostly awkward, but something in her voice stayed with him long after she left, something about the way she said the word healing. Not like a theory, but like a memory. 2 days later, he asked to see her again, under the pretense of a medical follow-up, and again she came, not because she wanted to, but because the hospital asked, because her supervisor thought it was appropriate, because somewhere deep down she was curious too. This time the room was quieter, the conversation less strained. She asked how he felt. He said different. Like he'd been asleep for years and didn't know it. She didn't laugh, didn't flirt, but she did ask him what scared him most about dying. He didn't answer, not directly, just said that dying wasn't the part that bothered him. It was the idea of not having lived fully, of being remembered as nothing more than a name attached to a number. That night he couldn't sleep. Over the next few weeks they saw each other again, sometimes by accident, sometimes by arrangement, and what started as scheduled blood monitoring turned into moments of conversation that bled into something else. He learned she liked sketching but never showed her work, that she listened to classical music when she was anxious, that she carried 2 sets of gloves in winter because she once gave hers away to a homeless woman and spent the rest of the night with frozen fingers. She learned he never drank coffee, preferred silence over small talk, and that his favorite room in his penthouse wasn't the office or the bedroom, but the indoor garden no one else knew existed. Their lives could not have been more different. He was wrapped in black suits and guarded schedules, she in scrubs and ink-stained notebooks. But when they spoke, the space between them felt less like distance and more like gravity. He began to schedule her appointments personally, asking her to stay longer each time, inviting her to sit, to talk, to just be there. She never stayed more than an hour, never asked for anything, never looked around like she was trying to memorize the riches around her. She just looked at him, and something about that undid him. One afternoon, during what was supposed to be a routine test, the power flickered, brief but enough to make the room dark for a second. And in that second, she reached for his arm, instinctively, reflexively, and he felt it. Not just her touch, but the electricity beneath it, the tremble she tried to hide. He didn't pull away. Neither did she. When the lights came back, she stepped back, apologized, said she didn't like the dark, didn't like the suddenness of it. He didn't say anything, just watched her, wondering how someone so careful could still shake the walls he had spent years building. He started looking forward to her presence more than he admitted, not just for the peace she brought, but for the questions she never asked, the way she never treated him like someone broken or someone powerful. Just someone. She was the only one who ever called him Julian without hesitation, without calculation, and she was the only one whose voice he replayed in his mind long after she left. She didn't know how to name what was happening between them, Neither did he. It wasn't romance in the traditional sense, no grand gestures or whispered confessions. It was quieter, more fragile, like two people learning how to breathe next to each other. She began to draw more, not because she had time, but because something inside her was softening. He began to sleep more, not because he was less busy, but because for the first time in years, sleep didn't feel like surrender. People around them noticed. His assistant remarked that he smiled more. Her classmate teased that she was humming while walking between lectures. But neither of them said anything. Not yet, because what they were building didn't have a name, and maybe it didn't need one. Not now, not yet, but it was real and growing and impossible to ignore. The first report came in quietly, hidden behind medical jargon and inconclusive footnotes. A preliminary analysis marked urgent but unread by most, until it reached the private inbox of Dr. Eliza Monroe, lead geneticist at St. Haven Medical Research Division, a woman known for her precision, her detachment, and her refusal to entertain speculation. She read the file once, then again, and by the third time, her hand had gone still against the mouse, her eyes fixed on a particular anomaly. The donor's blood. The sample that had not only stabilized Julian Cross, but reversed multiple signs of chronic cellular decay, carried a genetic marker she had never seen before, something outside the mapped human genome. The protein sequence was partially dormant, partially reactive, but fully unidentifiable. Her team reran the test, then another, using different machines, different labs, and each time the results came back with the same signature: an X-length protein bonded to a regenerative enzyme that triggered immune and stem cell response beyond any known human capability. The variable wasn't just rare, it was unprecedented, and it was only present in the donor, Leah Gray. They ran a full genomic comparison between Leah's sample and the general population database and found no match, not even partial. What made the finding more complicated was the second report that arrived 2 days later from an independent lab Julian's company had quietly commissioned. Their geneticists had discovered something even more curious. This rare protein began to denature rapidly when exposed to oxytocin surges consistent with sexual activity. In every subject studied, the protein degraded permanently after the first sexual experience, as if a chemical switch had been flipped, one that the body couldn't undo. This was not folklore. This was not purity myths wrapped in superstition. This was biology doing something no one had expected. Julian read the report in silence, sitting in his penthouse office as the city glowed beneath him, the words running over and over in his head, each one heavier than the last. Only present in women who had never been sexually active, only stable in a biological environment, unaltered by intimacy. The science didn't explain why, it only confirmed that it was true. He felt something twist inside him, something like guilt, but sharper. He had known Leah was different, had felt it from the first time she stood in his hospital room with eyes that didn't flinch and a voice that didn't flatter. But now he knew that difference was more than emotional. It was molecular, essential, and it put her in danger. The medical board wanted more samples. The hospital director asked if she would consider signing over temporary donation rights. The press hadn't caught wind yet, but Eliza warned him it was only a matter of time. Rumors like this didn't stay buried, especially not when the man being saved was one of the most powerful names in medicine. Julian refused to pressure her. He told Eliza not to contact Leah directly. He didn't want her to know yet, not until he could make sense of what it meant, not until he could find a way to protect her from being turned into a commodity, into a miracle people wanted to harvest, instead of a human being they should protect. But secrets don't stay quiet. It was during a quiet evening in the clinic's waiting room that Leah overheard 2 interns whispering about a patient with regenerative blood, a case being discussed in closed-door hospital meetings, a file that matched her own timeline. She didn't ask, didn't confront, but the name Julian was mentioned once, softly, and that was enough. She went home, opened her browser, and searched for scientific reports under her blood type, under the institution's recent studies. She found nothing official, but she found a message buried in a journal database anonymous. Anonymous, speculative, and disturbingly familiar. She confronted Julian the next morning, not with anger, not with shouting, but with silence that cut deeper than any accusation. He'd tried to explain, said he wanted to wait, to find the right time, the right words. But she shook her head slowly and asked one question that unraveled him more than any of the science ever could. Was this ever about me, or just what I carry inside me? He tried to reach for her, but she stepped back, her body stiff, her breath caught between disbelief and heartbreak. She wasn't angry because he kept secrets. She was angry because she had started to feel safe, started to believe in a connection that wasn't transactional, and now it all felt like a setup, a careful manipulation. He told her she wasn't just a donor, that her presence had changed more than his health, that she had made him feel things he didn't know were still possible. But it all sounded hollow now, too late, too clean. She told him she needed time, needed space, and when she left his apartment that night, she didn't look back. Julian didn't chase her, not yet. Instead, he called Eliza and told her to stop all research, to lock down the files, to erase any public access to the data. He instructed his legal team to draft an ironclad privacy order under his name, and he ordered the hospital to mark Leah Gray's file as restricted, accessible only by him. But the damage had already begun. One of the junior researchers had leaked a partial genome map to a private investor group, and within days, whispers began in biotech circles about a virgin donor with miracle blood. The story twisted with each telling, some claiming she could cure cancer, others saying she was part of a genetic experiment gone rogue. Leah started receiving strange emails, people asking for her blood, others offering money for interviews, some just sending threats disguised as curiosity. Her professors began treating her differently, her classmates whispering in hallways. She knew now what Julian had tried to prevent. But the question still burned in her. If he really wanted to protect her, why didn't he trust her with the truth? Why didn't he believe she could choose for herself? And deeper than that, buried under the science and the silence, was a quieter question she was afraid to voice. Had he felt something real for her, or just for the miracle inside her veins? She sat alone in her apartment that night, surrounded by unopened emails, her sketch pad untouched, and wondered if it was possible to feel both rare and unwanted at the same time. Across the city, Julian stared at his own reflection, seeing not the powerful man the world admired, but the broken boy who still didn't know how to love without destroying what he cared about. The truth had come out, but it hadn't set anyone free. Julian stood in the boardroom of Orion Tower. The city stretched out beyond the glass walls like a kingdom on pause. Executives seated around the table with guarded expressions, some with concern, others with veiled calculation. The leak about the donor, about Leah, had reached investors, and while no one mentioned her name directly, the implication hung heavy in the room. Words like asset, opportunity, and controlled exposure were tossed around as if they were discussing a product, not a person, as if she were a thing to be handled and not a human being who had unknowingly altered the course of his life. Julian said nothing for most of the meeting, fingers steepled beneath his chin, his mind replaying her face the night she walked away. When the CFO finally suggested they bring her in officially, offer her a confidential research agreement, and secure long-term biological rights, Julian stood abruptly, chair scraping across the floor. He looked at the table, each face familiar but suddenly foreign, and said in a tone that left no room for argument, "She's not a resource. She's not for sale. And if anyone here treats her like data again, they'll be looking for new careers." Then he walked out without waiting for a response, his decision final, his loyalty made clear. He didn't care if it cost him control, didn't care if the board questioned his motives, because for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about legacy or profit. He was thinking about someone whose eyes had seen through him, without needing anything in return. Meanwhile, Leah had disappeared, not entirely, not off the map, but she had withdrawn from everything that once anchored her. She stopped attending lectures, let her part-time shifts lapse, left her phone off for days at a time. She needed silence, not because it comforted her, but because it was the only thing that didn't demand answers. The emails kept coming, strangers wanting miracles, tabloids hinting at her identity, online threads debating her existence like she was a theory instead of a girl who used to draw in the back of biology class. She stayed in her apartment mostly, curtains drawn, sketchpad untouched, afraid to even open her door sometimes, because the world had taken something private and made it loud. But what hurt more than the attention was the space between her and Julian, not just physical, but emotional, the distance where something had once grown slowly, quietly, like a secret blooming in the dark. She hated that she still thought of him, hated that when she closed her eyes, she still remembered the way he listened like no one else ever had, how he asked about her dreams without flinching, how his silence had always felt safe, not empty. She told herself it was over, that trust broken couldn't be rebuilt, but some nights she caught herself sketching him without meaning to, his outline etched into her muscle memory, as if forgetting him meant forgetting a part of herself. Julian tried to give her space, tried to honor the walls she built even as it tore him apart, but as the headlines grew louder and the pressure mounted, he realized that silence was no longer protection, it was surrender. He began working in secret, hiring an independent legal firm to represent her interests, setting up anonymous ownership of the research data so no one, not even his own company, could claim rights over her body or her blood. He met with Eliza behind closed doors and told her to delete every file linking Leah's name to the anomaly, to wipe her DNA from the archives, to bury the miracle so deep it would never resurface. It wasn't enough. Not really. But it was something. A way to give her control in a world that had stripped it from her. But he knew it still wasn't the one thing she needed most. An apology. Not just for what he'd done, but for what he hadn't done. For not believing in her strength. For thinking he had to protect her by keeping her in the dark. One evening, long after the city lights had gone soft and the rain returned like a memory, Julian showed up at her door, not in a suit, not with a driver waiting, just him, soaked from the walk, holding nothing but a single white envelope. She opened the door slowly, surprised, guarded, unsure whether to speak or shut it again. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at her like she was the only thing that had made sense in a year filled with noise. Then he handed her the envelope, his fingers brushing hers for a second too long. She opened it cautiously, heart beating fast, and inside she found a document she didn't understand at first, legal jargon and signatures, until her eyes landed on the last page, a signed declaration forfeiting all research rights, nullifying any claims to her genetic material, her image, her name. She looked up, confused, and he finally spoke, voice low, steady, the words careful, like he'd rehearsed them 100 times. I can't change what's been done, and I can't promise the world will leave you alone, but I can give you this. I can give you back everything they tried to take. She stared at him, unsure whether to cry or laugh, the edges of her disbelief softening with every breath he took that didn't demand anything from her. He said more then, not about science or business, but about her, about how he had felt more alive in her presence than he had in years, how her silence had calmed him, how her eyes had made him feel seen, not as a billionaire or a patient or a headline, but just as a man. He told her that when she walked out, he didn't try to stop her because he thought she deserved freedom, but now he realized freedom didn't mean absence, it meant choice, and he had denied her that. Leah didn't answer right away, her hands shaking slightly as she folded the document, her breath catching in her throat, not because she didn't believe him, but because part of her still couldn't believe that anyone would fight for her without asking for something in return. She let him sit with her in silence for a while, neither of them speaking, both of them staring at the city beyond the window, and for the first time in weeks, her shoulders relaxed. He didn't try to reach for her, didn't push, just waited, and that patience undid her more than any plea ever could. Finally, she turned to him and asked, "Would you still want me if I had nothing special in my blood? If I were just a girl who got lucky once?" And he looked at her, eyes steady, and said, "I'd want you if you never gave me a drop, because what healed me wasn't your blood. It was your presence, your honesty, your refusal to treat me like I mattered more than anyone else. You made me feel like a man again, not a project, not a patient. And I don't want to lose that." Her voice broke when she said, "I'm scared." And he replied without hesitation, "So am I. But I'd rather be scared beside you than safe without you." And just like that, something shifted, not fixed, not forgotten, but shifted. And sometimes that's all it takes. 3 weeks passed quietly, not in peace, but in fragile recovery, the kind that takes shape in the spaces between words rather than grand declarations. Leah didn't move in. She didn't stay overnight, but she returned slowly, first for coffee in the morning, then for long walks in the evenings, no promises spoken, yet every moment thick with the unspoken weight of something real. Julian never pressed her, never asked for more than what she gave freely, and in return, she began to open in ways even she hadn't expected. She started sketching again, not just for herself but for him, leaving small drawings on his desk, on the kitchen counter, once even slipped into the pocket of his coat without saying a word. They weren't romantic, not exactly, more like windows into how she saw the world now. A world where fear didn't erase beauty, but existed alongside it. Julian framed every one of them, not because they were masterpieces, but because they came from her hand, from her time, from her choice to stay connected even when everything else had tried to tear them apart. Then came the foundation. Quietly, without press releases or staged photos, Julian redirected a large portion of his fortune to start a confidential medical trust, not in his name but in hers, not to capitalize on her anomaly, but to protect others like her, people with rare biological traits who might otherwise be exploited or erased. He didn't tell her right away, didn't want the gesture to feel performative, but when she found out, when she read the mission statement and saw her initials at the bottom of the founding document, she didn't say anything. She just looked at him for a long time and then leaned in, rested her forehead against his chest, and whispered thank you, like it wasn't just about the paperwork, but about the fact that someone had finally chosen to use their power to protect rather than control. Still, the peace didn't last. One evening, a letter arrived with no return address, no official seal, just a single envelope slipped beneath the door of Leah's apartment. Inside was a photograph, grainy but clear, of her and Julian on a park bench, laughing, his arm resting behind her shoulders, their faces close enough to suggest more than friendship. The photo was accompanied by a typed note with no signature, no threat, just a sentence that made her blood run cold. "They'll never stop watching." She didn't show it to Julian right away, didn't want to trigger another wave of legal panic or media lockdown, but it sat in her drawer like a ticking clock, and every time she reached for her sketch pad, she felt its weight. Days passed, and her quiet began to change, not just shy but distant, distracted. Julian noticed, but didn't push, until one night he found her staring out over the balcony, the unopened envelope clutched in her hand, her eyes blank. She handed it to him without a word, and he read it slowly, jaw tightening, breath steady but cold. He turned to her, not with panic but with quiet fury, the kind that came from someone who had built an empire on silence, but now found silence unbearable. He asked who she thought it was from, and she shook her head, said it didn't matter because it was true they were never going to be left alone. Julian didn't try to deny it. Instead, he asked what she wanted to do, and her answer came after a long pause, her voice low, almost afraid of its own clarity. "I want to disappear. Not forever, just long enough to breathe. He didn't try to talk her out of it. He made one call that night to an old friend in the security world, and within 24 hours a plan was in motion. They left the city quietly, no press, no escort, just two people stepping into the unknown together. The place was small, a coastal cabin with peeling paint and too many windows, but it smelled like salt and cedar and distance, and that was enough. For the first few days they said very little. They cooked simple meals, walked along the shore, read in silence, and slept separately, not because of fear, but because intimacy now meant something deeper than proximity. One night, as the waves crashed beyond the porch and the fireplace burned low, Leah turned to Julian and said, "I'm not special, not really." He looked at her, calm and steady, and said, "You are, not because of your blood, but because you survived long enough to still care." She shook her head, said, "But what if that part of me disappears? What if I wake up one day and it's gone?" He reached out, gently took her hand and said, "Then we let it go together." That night, she didn't return to her room. She stayed curled against him on the couch, listening to his heartbeat, not because she needed to be saved, but because she had finally chosen where to be vulnerable. They didn't make love that night. They didn't touch beyond the closeness of warmth and breath and trust, and in that stillness something between them solidified. But time never stops, not even for healing. A storm rolled in a week later, taking out power and phone service, and with it came a knock at the door that shouldn't have happened. Julian opened it to find a man in a dark coat with a badge from a federal agency he didn't recognize, holding a folder marked confidential and a tone that was too rehearsed to be anything but dangerous. The man didn't accuse, didn't threaten, but made it clear that someone in the National Health Division had taken interest in Leah's case, and while they had no intention of forcing cooperation, they would strongly advise a private meeting to discuss future applications of her blood. Julian said nothing, just took the card and shut the door. But the message was clear. The world was waiting. That night, Leah said she wanted to go home, not because she was ready, but because hiding wasn't the same as living. He nodded slowly, said he'd follow her lead, always. When they returned to the city, the whispers had quieted, but the pressure hadn't. Julian stood by her through it all, through the meetings she refused, through the papers she wouldn't sign, and when she finally said she was ready to speak publicly, not to explain herself, but to reclaim her story, he stood at the back of the room while she told the truth, not about science or purity, but about consent, about being seen, about what it means to be more than what the world expects you to be. And when she was done, when the applause faded and the lights dimmed, she walked straight into his arms, not as a symbol, not as a case study, but as a woman who had chosen love over fear. Months later, no headlines remained, the articles faded into digital dust, and the world moved on to newer stories, louder dramas, fresher scandals. But for Leah and Julian, the quiet was no longer something to fear. It became home, a rhythm they learned to live by, not because everything was perfect, but because they had chosen to stay when it wasn't. They didn't build a mansion together, didn't host glamorous parties, or sign book deals about their story. Instead, they created a life on the edges of the noise, simple and steady, filled with small joys that didn't need validation. Leah returned to school, part-time at first, not for degrees or recognition, but because she still believed in healing, not just through medicine, but through presence, through listening, through care. Julian shifted his role at the company, stepped back from daily operations, spent more time reading, walking, cooking with her in their kitchen, where the walls were lined with her framed sketches, and the light always felt soft, even on cloudy days. They still faced questions sometimes, from curious strangers or quiet interviewers who didn't know how to ask without prying, but they learned how to answer with grace, how to draw a boundary without building a wall, and in the middle of that new life, Leah began drawing again, not just for herself, but for others. a small online shop selling prints of oceans and skylines and faceless people holding hands in the dark. And slowly the girl who once felt like a medical anomaly became something far more human, a voice, an artist, a partner. On the anniversary of the day her blood saved him, Julian took her back to the cabin by the sea, the one with too many windows and not enough insulation, but just enough space for truth. They stood on the beach as the wind whipped around them, hair tangled, coats unzipped, and she said softly, "I used to think that night ruined my life, but maybe it started it." He didn't answer with words, just reached for her hand, pressed it to his chest, and let her feel the heartbeat she had unknowingly rescued. In that moment, she didn't feel like a virgin or a donor or a miracle. She felt like herself, whole and chosen, not because of what she carried, but because of who she was. And that was the point. The world had tried to define her by what she hadn't done, but Julian had loved her for what she dared to do stay, even when it was easier to run, believe, even when it was easier to doubt, choose connection, even when fear made isolation feel safe. They didn't promise forever, didn't speak in vows or fairy tales, but they looked at each other like two people who had already lived a lifetime in a single year and still wanted more. As the tide rolled in and the sky burned with the last blush of sunset, Leah whispered the words that had once terrified her. "I'm not afraid of being seen anymore." Julian smiled, eyes soft with something deeper than gratitude, and replied, "That's all I ever wanted." And in the gentle hush that followed, they stood together, not because fate demanded it, but because love, when chosen again and again, becomes the most powerful miracle of all.